much, Nora. Welcome to the presentation on what was it, trams and stuff. Yes.
Musical introduction?
Musical introduction. It has been a while since I did any choral singing, but you never know. Worked a little bit in Canada. I'd say I definitely recommend you take up the sport of curling. It's a lot of fun. But it's lovely to be back here today talking to you a little bit about my PhD because I'm actually currently on intermission and teaching, so it's sort of a good refresher so that I can actually remember what I'm doing as well. But as Nora mentioned, I'm part of the SET group, the Public Transport Research Group, Graduate Research Interdisciplinary Program. It keeps on changing its name. But anyway, I'm in a project that's sponsored by VicRoads, looking at how to improve bus and tram priority implementation. So that's the sort of stuff that I'll be talking about today. You are probably familiar with the idea of bus lanes, transit signal priority. You'll see those little B lights, the little white lights that let the buses go first. And it makes a lot of sense from an engineering rational point of view. We can get a heck of a lot more people in a bus than we can in a car. So we should be prioritising the buses. It makes sense for very many ways and means. And so we don't quite seem to get there in Melbourne. We have this situation where we give a lot of space to park cars, our trams get stuck, and in Zurich it's quite different. They seem to have figured this out. But here in Melbourne we're sort of stuck in that, if you take away a traffic lane, there'll be more traffic congestion. Where am I going to park my car if you put in a bus lane? These sorts of things. And this is sort of what we've seen happen a lot in Melbourne and Toronto. Problems with us trying to put in transit priority and then it getting taken over. And I happened to be there in Toronto. I arrived just after Mayor Rob Ford, who you might remember was the one who did quite a lot of drugs. Anyway, the first thing he said was, the war on the car is over. I didn't even know that there was a war on the car in Toronto, but apparently there was, and he was elected on sort of a suburban pushback against this idea of prioritising transit. So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about the literature review, talk a little bit about transit priority, and then legitimacy theory, which is something that we don't really think too much about in engineering because we're sort of stuck in this rational idea that everything should be according to the model. I'll talk a little bit about the case study methodology I've adopted in this PhD, give you some stories from some of the cases and how things have worked quite well in Zurich and Curitiba, and yet it's been a little bit more difficult in places like Melbourne and Toronto. And then give you some of the stuff that is coming out of this research, this idea of some pragmatic strategies for car-centric cities. And we're seeing stuff in Melbourne and Toronto and also Boston, as well as other places, the ways we can get some of this stuff done. So transit priority, evaluation perspectives. Us engineers are great at this sort of stuff. Perspectives on transit priority, well, we should be putting in bus lanes when there's tons of buses an hour. That makes a lot of sense. There's other perspectives such as mobilities. We should be putting in bus lanes and things like that when there's a lot of people in the buses, and there's more people in the buses than there would be in the cars in the lanes adjacent. So that sort of makes a lot of sense as well. Accessibility, we should put in bus lanes and things like that because it'll make it easier to get across the city on transit. It'll mean that our sort of spot on the map that we can get to in 20 minutes on transit will be bigger. That makes a lot of sense. Maybe we should be putting in transit priority because it'll mean that it'll be cheaper to run the trams. These things cost $6 million. A driver costs 50, 80 bucks an hour, something like that. We go through a lot of money having these things stuck in traffic. We should be putting in transit priority for social equity reasons. Again, you can model all this sort of stuff. We should be doing it for economic efficiency, or maybe we should be doing it for some of the strategic objectives that we're trying to get. So VicRoads has this big smart roads thing, although you might have noticed in the paper that VicRoads are now apparently no longer exists. But anyway, they have smart roads and this idea that this road is for transit and this road's for cars and this road's for freight and things like this. Graham Curry developed a framework for thinking about transit priority. This idea that in car-dominant cities we'd be doing subservient priority, where we'll put in an HOV lane, but it's fundamentally about moving people by cars. In a city where we're using transit to try and relieve congestion, we're going to put in transit priority during the peak hours because, hey, that's when everybody's trying to get around. So we should have a bus lane so that the transit goes faster than the cars, and that way people will ride transit. And we won't have to build as many freeways. Or maybe we should be in a place where our city goal is that transit replaces the car for sort of medium distance travel. And so in that case, we'd be looking to give transit fairly high priority, or indeed we might even give it sort of total priority. We might grade separate it, we might put in railway boom crossings, something like that. So a pretty simple sort of framework. The downside, however, is that as soon as we give preference to transit, other people are worse off. And different stakeholders have different perspectives on this sort of stuff. And so while we as engineers might be thinking, oh yeah, this is what it should be, we should definitely be putting in transit so that people can ride that instead of driving around their cars. Fundamentally, this is what happens in the real world. We put in things in Clarendon streets, and the local traders hate it because we took away a few parking spots. We tried this big, huge think tram idea in Melbourne. We had this great target, 25% decrease in tram journey times, and we really didn't get there. It was very hard to get any traction because there was a lot of opposition. Brisbane, they've been removing transit lanes, and fundamentally that's a political decision. In Toronto, the busiest streetcar in Toronto, King Street, 65,000 passengers a day. Yeah, we'd like to make transit better, but as long as we don't do anything to impact the 100 businesses along that street, that's the sort of political realm that we live in. And this is a problem in transport research. We're so busy looking at all these models. How would we make the transport in Melbourne more efficient? How would we do all this sort of stuff? And fundamentally, we're not really paying much attention to any of the actual politics, the power. We're off in this techno-rational world where everything can be modelled and all the decisions are made according to a rational focus. But fundamentally, that's not how it works in transport. We're in the political sphere. And so Marsden and Reardon did a look at some of the papers in the leading transportation journals, and they found that most of them contain all these quantitative models. And they're not really about how transport decisions are made. And you would have noticed in the recent budget, there's a lot of announcements about this ginormous road project and this ginormous this and this ginormous stuff. And some of that is being guided by institutions like Infrastructure Australia and Infrastructure Victoria, and a lot of them are sort of being made politically. So us as engineers, we're too busy off in the model world, and we're not really thinking about how these decisions are made in real life. And that's fundamentally about what this PhD is trying to look at. We're sort of looking at this intersection of transit priority research and some of the ideas and thoughts that actually already exist way over on the other side of campus in political science. There's this big area called legitimacy theory, which is very popular in international relations. Fields of research that we really don't think about as engineers.